Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Next Man Up podcast. I'm your host, Banning and Colin. I'm here with your co-host, Colin Martin,
How's it going?
and we got a lot to talk about in the NBA and NFL worlds this week. So I think we just got to get right into it. And before this video starts, if you guys go down below, smash that like button and subscribe if you haven't yet. We're out here every single week, every single Thursday. There's going to be a new episode. So let's just get right into it. So first, we're going to start off with the NFL. We're just going to start with probably the biggest news in the NFL world right now, Lamar Jackson. It's been floating around whether we've both speculated if he signed somewhere else, but officially we saw that he requested a trade on March 4th. So just to start off, some teams that could be interested in him, we'll talk about those. And we'll just start off with the Patriots. The other day, for context, Meek Mill got a text from Lamar Jackson and then texted, who did he text after that?
Robert Kraft.
Yeah, he texted Robert Kraft. So, and he said that Lamar Jackson wants to play for the Patriots. Last week we talked about if this would be a smokescreen, not in this context, but just Lamar Jackson going to the Patriots. So how do you feel about this?
I mean, I think I'm in a completely different spot than I was last week. Bill Belichick, if you're hearing me, I'm begging you to do something. In 2018, we already made the mistake of taking Sony Michel over this guy, and it's time to man up and just trade for Lamar. Mac is not the future in New England, no matter what old people on Twitter want to tell you. And, considering that every year the Patriots love to trade down in the draft anyways, I wouldn't be worried about giving up early draft capital. I think, the Patriots are a team that lack weapons in pretty much every position on offense. Let's go get a quarterback that's proven he can perform without high level weapons. Our defense has proven time and time and again that they'll pick up slack. I think it's time. How do you feel about, Lamar possibly going to the Patriots?
I don't think he's going to go there. I would say maybe 1% chance that he goes there. I think obviously he's friends with Meek Mill or whatever. He told him that. But I mean, like that, I've heard one thing about it. Usually we hear a lot more about it if it's really going to happen. I guess it makes sense if he goes there, but we'll talk about some other options that I feel like suit him better. And I just feel like unless he specifically told him, like I'm guessing that was maybe on the list. I don't think he's just like I just want to play for the Patriots, but I mean reporting goes however people want to word it. So I think there's a slight chance that he goes there, but if I'm Lamar Jackson, a team that I would rather go to, in my opinion, right now is I think the best fit for him is the Falcons. I know not a great team right now, but offensively they have young weapons, and especially in a guy like Kyle Pitts, I know that would entice Lamar Jackson. We saw his connection with Mark Andrews and how Mark Andrews was an all-pro tight end, and Kyle Pitts. I don't really know if there's an argument here, but I think he has definitely a higher ceiling than Mark Andrews, especially with his agility and just what he brings to the table too. And a guy like Drake London, who I'm not a huge fan of, but he's still a good young receiver, and whatever else they choose to go with in this draft, whether in the first round, that's still defensively if they get Lamar, but even in the second round, definitely could take a receiver too. So how do you feel about that, Lamar Jackson?
Yeah, I mean, the Falcons wouldn't be a bad fit for all the reasons you just said. I do worry about Lamar when it comes to competing. And although I know, for example, if you went to the Patriots, it would be tough because you'd be in the AFC East, which is absolutely flooded with talent right now. But if you go to Atlanta, you get the weaker conference, but you get a much worse team. I think Atlanta specifically has a lot of things that they really need to figure out too. And these are needs I think they should assess in the draft. Edge is one that comes to mind. If they give up draft picks to get Lamar, of course you're going to have a huge improvement at quarterback, but you still have one of the worst defenses in the league. So for like Lamar's sake, I like the fit. For the Falcons, although it sounds nice, I think you need to hold on to your draft capital. Another team we have down here is the Colts. If Lamar Jackson goes to Indianapolis, I think it's assumed that they'd be moving on from the 4th overall pick. How do you think that would shake up the board?
Well, I mean, we've been talking about whether they take Anthony Richardson or Will Levis at this point. So this basically opens up the Raiders to whichever one of those two quarterbacks that they like, unless we see another team trade up. But I think it would be, especially for the Colts, like the 4th overall pick is very different from like if you're trading the second or the third, even though it's only 2 spots, you're not going to get the guy specifically that you want. You would be getting the third best quarterback at this point. So I think it's definitely worth it if you're the Colts. The team, not amazing at this point. They've had bridge quarterbacks the past few years, but this would definitely kind of help fill that up. Obviously, you have Jonathan Taylor, who struggled a little bit with injury, but he's still really young, so I'm not worried too much about that. And I mean, on the outside, you can definitely develop the receivers a little more too. You're not that worried about it at this point. And even if Lamar goes there, that opens up the possibility of signing a guy like Odell. I don't think Odell looks at the Colts at all right now, but if Lamar goes there, Odell could definitely be the number 1 or number 2 guy there almost immediately.
I will go out on a limb and say, out of the realistic options, this might be one of the best ones for Lamar. As you mentioned, the Colts have been doing this whole old bridge quarterback thing. I think it's time for them to invest in a quarterback again, the same way they did Andrew Luck before his early retirement. And if I'm Lamar, I get to team up with Jonathan Taylor, assuming he's healthy. That's a great duo. And Michael Pittman Jr. would automatically become the best receiver Lamar's ever had to play with. You know, I have my thoughts on Michael Pittman Jr. I don't think he is league best or anything, but he's an easy improvement for anything Lamar's played with before. So I would like that fit from both sides. But that, you know, it begs the question, and we don't have this down. If the Ravens do get that 4th overall pick, do you think they invest in a guy like Anthony Richardson at 4, who plays very similar to Lamar, but you wouldn't have to pay clearly? Or would you roll with Tyler Huntley and take best player available at that point?
I think for them, you take best player available, and then you go into next year assuming that the Ravens aren't going to be this good. I mean, I'm at the point this year where if you're not going to be competing, I think, and you're kind of in that range where you might not get the guy that you want, I think you just wait until next year. The quarterbacks are really good next year. And I think another team in that Lamar Jackson like sweepstakes right now is the Titans. If they don't get him, I think they're in that same scenario. You wait until next year. And especially with teams like the Texans, who probably are going to be a top 5 pick next year, who aren't going to need a quarterback again. And even teams, I mean, it depends on who we see, but the Raiders could be up there again too. But if they get a quarterback, they're not going to need to draft a quarterback next year. So the crop of quarterbacks next year is going to be a lot better than this year. And a guy like Caleb Williams, who's potentially the number 1 guy right now, but we never know what's going to happen with a guy like Drake May also in that class. And then there's going to be a few other guys that rise up. So I guess just to answer that question, I think if you get Lamar, obviously that works out. But if you're the Ravens in this scenario, I think you just take best player available, especially at 4. You can take a guy like Jordan Davis, who not Jordan Davis. I always get the 2 mixed up now. Now we've been talking about Jordan Davis a lot. They could take Jalen Carter at that pick too. So speaking of quarterbacks in the draft, though, we've heard a lot of news about your guy Hendon Hooker. Today it came out that he possibly going 5th overall to the Seahawks. I just want to hear your initial reactions on this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to break it down. And this is coming from me, who's a very big Tennessee Volunteer football fan. It would be a horrible pick. I mean, just a downright horrible pick. Seattle specifically just signed Geno for 3 more years. Assuming you know, honor that contract and, you know, put Hooker on the bench for a year or 2, he wouldn't be getting his first start until he's 27 years old. Investing a top 5 pick, which especially for Seattle does not come around often, and into a quarterback who wouldn't even get his first start until he's the age of current Patrick Mahomes. Think of how long Mahomes has been running the league. That would be where Hendon Hooker would be starting from. And wasting a top 5 pick on that is idiotic to me. But if we're going to talk straight talent-wise, Hendon Hooker is talented enough to be in that pick. I think genuinely he's a more talented quarterback than a guy like Will Levis, who we've seen going that early in mock drafts. But the injury concern, the age concerns, and even the team fit, I think if you're Seattle, don't chase a quarterback this year. I think it's idiotic. But I see how, you know, that mock draft that we're talking about came from former Jets GM. When you're a GM, you get talking with other GMs and, you know, you start to catch a buzz. If, you know, with this buzz, I can see Hooker finding his way into the first round. But Hooker's not a guy you can take day one and plan to sit him for 2 years. He's too old.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about a guy who famously picked a quarterback for the Jets who didn't really work out so well too.
Yeah,
I came on here 2 weeks ago and I said that if the Seahawks didn't take Jalen Carter, that'd be their biggest mistake since passing the ball on the goal line. If they take Hendon Hooker, this is 15 times worse. At the 5th overall pick, you can't take a guy who's 25 right now, coming off of an ACL injury, and who basically had one good year in college, whether how good it is or not. If he's a day one starter, that's different. But if he goes out there and sits, it's not like it just doesn't work out for you. And people are saying, oh, well, then it's the same scenario with Stetson Bennett. No one is saying Stetson Bennett should go 5th overall. I've been seeing this. I was looking into it today, and that was the main argument for it. Oh, well, if Hendon Hooker shouldn't go there, then what about Stetson Bennett? Stetson Bennett is a day 3 guy. And
yeah.
I mean, Hendon Hooker has a higher ceiling at this point. But I mean, like, I don't know if it's really that much higher.
I mean that's a stretch. I was with you the whole way. His ceiling is much higher. But with that being said, I agree. Just because they're similar ages doesn't mean they're in similar situations. I would say though, I'm glad that there's some light being shined on Hendon Hooker because he legitimately is a first round guy to me. I know he's old. I know he has the injury concerns, but injury concerns is a term we throw around a little too lightly sometimes. This is only serious injury he's ever had, although a big one. He's not an injury prone player. He's just old to me. So if I'm a team in the late first round or a team that's looking to trade up into the early second round, I might test my luck on Hendon Hooker. If I have the option of trading up, let's say I'm Tampa Bay. If I get to either trade up for Will Levis or sit back and take Hendon Hooker, at this point I would sit and take Hooker. So I think it's interesting that his name is being thrown around more.
Yeah, I think the only issue is I don't think it's really like injury prone. I think it's just the fact that it's an ACL on a
Yeah,
quarterback, and ACL on pretty much any mobile player in the league at this point, unless you're just a tight end that blocks, is like I don't know. It's really hard to come off an ACL injury. I mean, we've seen it happen recently, so I think people forget that like it actually is pretty tough to come off of. And for a guy like him who kind of had it at the worst possible time, especially not being able to prepare for the draft the way that he wanted to. Obviously, you can still, I'm sure he's at the point where he can throw the ball around at least, but not be able to
yeah,
like have all the workouts that he hoped to have and stuff. But
yeah.
I
I
think if they
mean,
take him at 5, definitely not a good pick. But I think, I mean, late first round, definitely the start of the second round, I would say he will get taken at this point.
yeah, and I think we're on the same page with that. To transition to another guy who's had unfortunate ACL-esque injuries at poor times in their career. I mean, your guy Saquon Barkley, he's on your wall. And reports we've got more recently are that he's out of New York in the foreseeable future. How do you feel about that? Like, what's the initial vibe with that?
Well, looking through everything today, we got some news that it looks like they took away the offer that they initially offered him before the tag. So unless they're planning on giving him more money, which I doubt, it looks like Saquon will be out after this season. But I mean, as a as a running back in the NFL right now, it's I don't know how upset I can be. Obviously, I'm a big Saquon fan, but if they're getting rid of him at this point, um, I can't be too upset just because obviously there's still injury concerns. But if he comes out this season with 2,000 scrimmage yards or more, I think the Giants go back and look at the offer. I don't think he's already gone. He's definitely not out of the door already. He's expressed how much he wants to stay in New York. And especially if they end up with a guy, like if they end up signing Odell at some point and they get them back together. Depends on Daniel Jones' steps this year, too, if he progresses. I just don't think that the Giants want to invest into a running back at this point, especially a guy like Saquon, who has been great when he's on the field, but when he's off the field, that's the biggest issue. I mean, availability is the best ability to have, and especially from a position that is kind of almost dying out with the amount of elite players at that position. I think Saquon will get a look at in the offseason, but from this point, if he leaves, then I think they definitely could replace him next year with kind of a lower tier guy and kind of move towards a more wide set offense and start to throw more.
Yeah, and I think it's sad to see because, as you know for sure, in some of the Giants' darkest seasons, Saquon was the only thing they really had going for them. And it's kind of sad to see how, the Giants have built up a now competitive roster, but he's kind of on the way out. And as you mentioned, like I 100% agree that with the amount of young running backs we see come in and shine, you just can't invest that much into the position right now. I mean, we're already seeing teams like the Titans struggle because they have invested into the running back position. And that's why we see, guys as Derrick Henry level being on the trade market. So I agree with you in the sense that, it's a little disheartening for Giants fans, I imagine. But, it's just something that comes naturally with the progression of a team at this point.
Yeah. And I mean, teams, like you said, not really to invest in running backs. Even at this point, we're seeing teams being hesitant to invest in a former MVP at running back with Lamar Jackson. So it's just interesting to look at.
I thought that was going to be a hot take about prime Ezekiel Elliott, but
Oh yeah, no, not Ezekiel Elliott.
some
He's
random
not good.
random disrespect to a top 5 NFL quarterback is also, I guess, something you'll see on this podcast.
Oh yeah, Lamar's still good, but it's okay to call him a running back every once in a while.
Yeah, whatever you say.
He's still better than Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts is a
Yeah.
running back.
All right. I think there's some Super Bowl Patrick Mahomes bias going on here, but to move out of the NFL before things get too chippy, I think now is a good time to transition to the NBA. I mean, there's a lot more NFL stuff coming up in the future, but we're getting hot with the timing in the NBA right now. Teams are making playoff pushes. And last episode, we talked about if it's time to hit the panic button on the Dallas Mavericks. We both came on here and said yes, and it's gotten much worse since then. So give us an overview. What's going on in Dallas right now?
So since we've recorded, they ended up getting swept by the Hornets within 2 days, losing to the Warriors, losing to the Grizzlies, barely squeaking out a win against the Lakers, and then going to overtime against the Spurs, and then also getting destroyed by the Grizzlies again. And as of our recording last night, they played against the Pacers and finally got a win. Not that impressive, though, especially off of that losing streak. And the thing with this is obviously they're not having a great season right now, but you put them in the playoffs, and especially if they're going up against a team like the Clippers, it's going to really come down to Kyrie and Luka against Kawhi and Paul George. And that series is interesting to look at too. Even if they end up matching up against the Kings, like I can't really count out Luka and Kyrie at this point. And I know we both kind of agreed that maybe we hit the panic button this season on them and give them the full off season, and then kind of build back up next year. I'm not too worried about next year. I know a lot of people have been talking about that, but I mean, you got to give them a full off season. But for this year, I guess we have to see how the seeding ends up. But at this point, if I'm the Mavericks, who right now are 11th, but as we know, the West changes so much. They're only 2 games out of the 6th seed. So if they end up in that 6 to 8 seed, I think they definitely win a play-in game and probably end up with that 7 or 8 seed. But if they stay at 11th and there's only a week left in the season and they are kind of on that edge of the play-in game, if they end up as the 10th seed and then have to compete against teams like the Pelicans, the Lakers, the Warriors, as of right now, I don't know how lucky they get.
Yeah, and like my 2 cents on this is I feel like there's a lot of obvious factors of why the Mavericks aren't working out. Everyone points to defense. That's a big issue. Luka and Kyrie work together, but who's taking these last shots? Who needs the ball in their hands more? I think one thing that's not being discussed enough that I've heard from more Mavericks fans on the internet, what is Jason Kidd doing? These rotations that he's put onto the floor have been poor. And we've seen Jason Kidd struggle with rotations in the past. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, and this is some of the most hating I'm going to do in any episode. Jason Kidd has got carried by teams his whole career. Jason Kidd, an amazing point guard, an underrated player, one of the most overrated NBA coaches ever. he gets carried by having a young superstar on his team and then completely flops. And then once he leaves, then the teams find a way to figure it out. I just think I don't think he's putting together rotations that make sense for the Mavericks. And clearly he's not coaching them to wins as they've been on the skid.
Yeah, I mean, this team, obviously, there's issues, like you said, with defense. Big man, definitely shaky down there in the paint,
Yeah.
especially if they go up against teams like we mentioned before. If they go up against the Kings, Sabonis is going to get 40-point triple doubles every single game. If I don't think they're going to end up against the Nuggets in the first round, I don't think they'll be the 8th seed. But I mean, I guess the top 3 seeds right now, they'd either face the Nuggets, the Grizzlies, or the Kings. All 3 of those centers, I guess, considering Jaren Jackson a center, are going to eat. And I mean, Kyrie and Luka might drop 40 each, but if they're the only guys scoring and you have Maxi Kleber down there in the paint against a guy like Jaren Jackson, Sabonis, or Jokic, he's going to get absolutely cooked all game.
Yeah, and the thing is, even Christian Wood, who we acknowledge is a good player, his glaring weakness is defense. So as you just alluded to, you know, you don't even need to be going against a top tier center. If you go against a center who is strong and has any scoring ability, they're just getting cooked down there. So I think I would press the panic button again. But as you mentioned, give them an off season, fire Jason Kidd, you can figure things out.
Yeah, as of right now, I mean, when we look at all the standings, it's going to change a lot, especially in the West. There's going to be teams who obviously end up making the playoffs and teams who don't. So one team that I want to talk about, who I'll ask you your opinion on to start, is how do you feel the Lakers are going to end up in the standings? LeBron just came back the other night, and as of right now, when we're recording this, they are the 9th seed, and they're only 1 game away from the Pelicans.
Yeah. So I haven't had the best feeling about the Lakers this year in general. But with that being said, right now, I do like where they're at. I think they're going to stay in that 9 seed or maybe the 10 spot, but I'm really guessing 9 right now because they're a play-in worthy team. With the Warriors and the Pelicans have both been playing pretty good basketball lately, especially the Pelicans. They're really on a streak as of right now. So I don't see LA making that jump. With that being said, I like OKC, but I think the Lakers are a better team right now. I think they'll fend them off. And if you're the Lakers, I mean, I can't really predict who they're going to go against in the play-in, but I've been, the type of person to say that they're not a playoff team all year. But if they get a good matchup and LeBron is back, I think AD has underratedly had a good stretch of games recently. I think they're a playoff team, which, is crazy to say, but I think in the absence of LeBron, they haven't been exceptional, but they've impressed me of how they've stayed in the race. And that might just be more of a facet of the West, but you play, if you're in the West, you play in the West. You can't blame the Lakers for being in a tight race right now with a bunch of other teams.
Yeah, and I mean, especially for the start of the season with the amount of players that they kind of went through, and also just, I mean, the team not being great to start. They've been great since the break, getting D'Angelo Russell and I mean, everyone else they've got at that point, and then LeBron obviously coming back now helps. But I mean, the glaring issue right now that I have is Darvin Ham, who is probably bottom 5 coach in the NBA. I feel pretty confident in saying that. Just bad overall. And I kind of want to segue this into I didn't write this down, but just mentioning, I think people kind of forget that LeBron James has had one good coach his whole career. If you look top to bottom, I think saying this, obviously Mike Brown was there with the Cavs in 2005, but that is not the same Mike Brown that is on the Kings right now. The only good coach that he's ever had was Eric Spoelstra. And I know you were talking earlier about a guy that gets carried in Jason Kidd. Ty Lue has never been a good coach. And I know there's people that either say that he's a very good coach or bad. There's not really an in between like a guy like that. He reminds me a lot of a guy like Bruce Arians, who Tom Brady carried to the Super Bowl. They're just guys like Ty Lue had LeBron on his team. And when they were on the Cavs, I mean, you look at that team, and the Cavs team from 2016 to 2018, excluding that championship year after that, once Kyrie left, like in 2018, LeBron was bringing terrible players to the finals. Like J.R. Smith was the second best guy. Kevin Love was on one leg. It was just terrible. Tristan Thompson was, I mean, like he was down in the paint, but he didn't do anything.
Yeah.
LeBron James, I think, especially for a guy who's considered to be, by I would say by some the greatest player, and if not, definitely number 2 by a lot of people. I think one thing that we forget and we leave out is that he has only had one good coach in his whole career, and especially now with a guy like Ham, who is absolutely useless, and he has not had a good coach since he's been on the Lakers too. Even for this team to be afloat right now, I think just shows how kind of the players, like they want to win,
Yeah.
despite Ham's whatever he does.
Yeah. And while in Cleveland, that's when we saw people make the Lee GM, Lee coach jokes. And I think people maybe thought it was LeBron overstepping, but I would argue for LeBron that it's the coach is not doing anything. LeBron as a veteran player kind of had to be one of the coaches. And while we're on the topic of Cleveland, I think it's a perfect time to segue into one of our next points. And the Cavs are in a pretty good spot right now. They're one of the best teams in the East. They've had a lot of competition, and they give teams runs for their money. So as we're going into the playoffs, how much noise do you think Cleveland can really make?
I mean, we've talked about this a little bit through the past weeks, but especially now, I would say the seeding probably won't change that much. We have the Bucks at 1, the Cavs at 4, and then the Celtics and Sixers at 2 and 3. So I'm guessing these will probably be the semifinal matchups in the East. And I'm still going to stay with it. I think the Cavs give the Bucks a run for their money. I don't see this series going under 6 games. I think the Cavs definitely can win at least 2 games. And depending on how Chris Middleton plays and the rest of that Buck squad around them, I think the Cavs might even be able to pull this one off, which might sound weird, but I mean, we've seen this happen before when the Bucks played the Nets and it was just KD. The Bucks went out there and said, "Our game plan, we're going to let KD drop 40 on us, but if no one else can score on us, then that leads to a good win." And especially with a team like the Cavs, who have one of the best playoff performers in the NBA right now in Donovan Mitchell, and they have a lot of older veteran guys on that team. Even though that team's young, coming off of the bench unit, especially in the playoffs, you need guys that aren't scared to take that shot.
Yeah. Hey, and if I'm Cleveland, I'm feeling really good right now. Starting in the first round, it's looking like a lock that they're either going to play the Knicks or the Nets. And you know my opinion on the Knicks. The Nets are obviously a lot different of a team than what got them to that playoff spot. So either way, I think that's an easy win for the Cavs. And then, as you mentioned, after that with the Bucks, I don't even think it's letting Giannis score. I think we both know that Giannis is like all NBA stature comes from his inside scoring game. What do the Cavs have? The best rim defending duo in the league with Evan Mobley and Jared Allen. Those guys on their own are not going to stop Giannis by any means. But if you're crowding the paint and you're forcing Bucks players to take shots, I like Chris Middleton. I like Drew Holiday. Of course, I like Giannis. But when it comes to the 3-point shooting, I'm not putting the house on any of them. And as you alluded to, Donovan Mitchell, although he has many years in Utah where he gets knocked out in the first round, we remember the bubble where he was going back and forth with Jamal Murray. He is a torch. And with the improvement of Darius Garland, I'm all big for any form of basketball. When it's playoff time, you need a strong point guard. I'm a big Darius Garland believer. I think he is that guy. As you mentioned, man, if they can beat, one of the New York teams in the first round, beat the Bucks in the second round, it's an NBA Finals team. Just you have to give it to them at some point.
Yeah, I think based on what we have right now, I think the Knicks will probably stay in that 5 seed, and then I think the Cavs will probably end up at that 4 seed. So that matchup, I do think the Knicks probably win 1 game, just
Yeah.
because I'm assuming that Julius Randle and those guys can get it done. But I mean, I think the Cavs have an easy first round, and then, but also not necessarily like a sweep, which is sometimes good, especially in the first round. You want your guys to be able to have at least a little bit of competition too. So then they kind of warm up. And then the Bucks going against, at this point, it's either going to be the Hawks or the Raptors, or maybe the Bulls if they end up winning out the play-in game. But any 3 of those teams, I think, is an easy sweep too. So especially going into that second round, I think that's going to be a great series, and I could honestly see it going either way. I do think best case scenario for the Bucks is to win in 6, and best case for the Cavs is to win in 7.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So, I mean, to bring it from some of the best teams in the NBA we were just talking about, Let's do a 180 and switch to some of the worst teams. The draft race has gotten much more interesting. Victor has maintained his spot at number one, but we've seen guys like Scoot and Brandon Miller and the Thompson brothers, swing around for that second spot. The point being, you want the number one pick this year, just like any year, but especially in 2023. So there's a couple teams fighting for the bottom right now. Who do you think will get the first overall pick, and who do you think will benefit the most if they do get it?
So at this point, I think it's really just between the Pistons, the Spurs, and the Rockets. Whether they win or lose the next games, it doesn't really matter with the lottery odds too. But also, I mean, any three of these teams, we can't really predict who wins. But out of these three teams, for the Spurs, I think it's a really interesting situation because he goes in there and then is coached by, I would say, probably the greatest NBA coach of all time in Pop. Obviously not in his prime at this point, but he's got a lot to say too. And that team isn't amazing, but they do have some good young pieces, just like the Rockets too. The Rockets kind of a little more interesting just because I don't really see them getting any better. Even if they get Victor, I think they'll win some more games, but they don't have a direction at all. And I think the Spurs kind of have a little more of a direction. The Pistons, another interesting one too. Cade is not playing for the rest of the season. He's been out for what, since like the All-Star break, maybe a little earlier.
Yeah,
So
most
obviously that
most of the
team
year.
not doing great. Yeah. And that roster, um, it's good. We've seen James Wiseman kind of ball out recently. No one really cares though because it's the Pistons. But
Yeah.
guys like Killian Hayes too. I don't think the fit really works that well, especially if you're have a guy like James Wiseman and Marvin Bagley already there, because you don't really want to give up on both of those guys because they're both really young too. And I think the best fit right now would be the Spurs, not just with Pop, but just the way that the roster is kind of built too.
Yeah, and I really liked all those points you just threw out there, and it mirrors what I wrote in my notes a lot. A couple teams I was thinking about, the Pistons, the Hornets, the Rockets. You look at those teams, and clearly they're pretty bad. They don't have a lot going for them, but the Rockets' best player is Alperen Sengun. You don't want to bring Victor in and screw that up because, I mean, unless you are comfortable bumping Victor to the four, that's kind of a lot going on in the front court. And with the Hornets, I think their best piece outside of LaMelo is Mark Williams at center. He's like, and you cannot move Mark Williams because he can't shoot. So again, it's moving Victor around. And as you alluded to, if Pop gets a hold of Victor Wembanyama, I don't think Pop is going to be around long enough to see like an NBA championship version of him. But if I'm a young star and I get to be molded by the best coach ever, it immediately puts a much quicker timetable for the Spurs to win an NBA championship. And we know how San Antonio is. They like to compete. They have great GMs. They have moving pieces around there. You already have the wings with Johnson and Vassell. You get Victor at the five. You really just got to figure out your point guard situation, and then you're already competing in the playoffs. So I would really like to see the Spurs get the number one overall pick. And then after that, I mean, there's so much talent still on the board. I think we both know Scoot will probably go second. But after that, really anything could happen.
Yeah. I mean, either way, if let's say the Spurs do end up getting it, I think that kind of obviously the other teams are going to end up losing out on the best player in the draft, but a team like the Pistons who could definitely use a guy like Scoot Henderson too. I know that they keep drafting like pretty much every single team too. The Rockets keep drafting guards. That's just how the NBA is.
Yeah.
They kind of just like keep drafting guards until they find the right ones.
Well,
That's
one
what the Cavs did for a while too.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's really interesting about this to me that I want to throw out there is that the four teams that I see competing for this, you had three, I throw the Hornets in there. Why not? Competing for this number one overall pick, they both are really good at, or they're all really good at point guard and center, and that's it. And the top two guys are a point guard or center. The only team that doesn't fit into that mold is the Spurs. So if the Spurs get the first pick, they get to put Victor up to five. But if they get the second pick, they get to figure out their point guard. So really, it's surprising to me because I don't think the Spurs are the worst team on this list, but I think this draft easily benefits them the most. So that's one thing I want to point out.
I think either way, even if they end up falling to that three pick, if they take a guy like Amen Thompson, I think that, or depending if they like a Soar more, that's a good guard for them. Because in the NBA right now, I mean, both of those guys, they've played together pretty much their whole life. So naturally, Amen's been the point guard and Asur's been the shooting guard. But once you get to that next level, I mean, it all changes, especially
Yeah.
with the way that anyone can carry the ball up the floor at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, we were just talking about these early draft picks. I'm going to do another segue into one of the first picks last year, Chet Holmgren. There's a lot of news coming out that OKC has made him available, even though I think we both don't see him coming back this year. So we're more looking forward to next year. How do you think that Chet would fit into Oklahoma City's system, and how high would he be on your way too early Rookie of the Year race?
Um, I've never been a big fan of him. I think he'll end up panning out. I don't think he's going to end up being this like all NBA guy, which might be a hot take, especially being a number one overall pick. But we've seen in the NBA in the past 15 years that pretty much if you're the first overall pick, you're going to be an all NBA guy, or you're not going to be in the league within like 5 years. That's just how it's gone. The first overall pick has been very boom or bust recently. And I still think Victor has some good traits too, but especially on the team like the Thunder, which weren't supposed to be a competing team this year. And I mean, they're the 10 seed right now, but they're still competing for a play-in spot, especially in that heavily contested West. I thought that they were going to end up being kind of more towards that top 10 pick just because I thought Shea was going to end up playing really well, but the rest of the team, like Josh Giddey, a good player, but he's not going to go and drop 25 points every night. He's kind of an all-around guy, more of a passing player too. So I think him coming back obviously helps the Thunder, but the way that he fits into the rotation is kind of interesting to me, just because a player that they've had this year, especially looking at both of the Jay Williams, J Dub. We'll talk about him later in the Rookie of the Year race, but even Jalen Williams has had a good year. Obviously, Chet's going to go in there too, but at this point, Chet's had a year off, and competing against other centers, there was a potential where he could have been the four, but I don't think you put him at the four now and then move J Dub to the five. I don't see that working out.
See, I totally disagree with the situation. I also want to point out that, this is a minor thing, but Chet went number 2 last year. And I think he'll fit great, personally. I think OKC loves to move fast, they love to shoot, and that's the perfect play style for Chet, who's not a back to the basket big. I mean, next year he's going to have a lot of competition at the position. Jalen Williams, not J Dub, J Will, has performed really well, and I like how he is. But Chet Holmgren is a much better prospect, and I'm guessing a much better player. And if we're talking about the Rookie of the Year race next year, we've seen it many times before. We've seen Ben Simmons, who we're going to talk about pretty soon. We've seen Blake Griffin, guys that are hurt, sit for we saw Joel Embiid, guys that get hurt early and then have time to prep with an NBA team and then come off the injury, perform really well. I don't, in my notes, I say he would be my early Rookie of the Year favorite for next year. But even besides that, I think he's going to perform really well. And the Thunder, having a good year is much more promising. I'd rather have a team that coming off a good year and slide a new center in, a guy that's been with the team, than have him, come in with another raw rookie early pick next to him. I like the situation for him personally.
I'm just not a big fan of him overall. So,
Yeah.
I mean, we'll have to see if he ends up proving me wrong, but I think he'll be a good player. But especially in that offense, with a guy like Shea who's going to drop, I mean, next year he could end up dropping 35 points a game. So obviously, he's not going to be the number one scoring option too. So I think he'll still definitely be the number two at that point. But we could definitely see some pick and roll opportunities. But I mean, my concerns have kind of stayed the same, especially coming off of an injury too. The way that he matches up against most centers in the NBA, I just don't really see that being as favorable. But also, being able to shoot from the outside, especially if he's going against a center, that definitely brings a lot more up because you either shoot the ball if they give you room, or we've even seen it with guys like Jokic and Embiid this year, where if they are moving up on you because you're outside, then you can easily just fake it and drive to the rim.
Yeah, I mean, I respect the opinion. When Chet was coming into the draft class, I was not a big fan of his. I like the fit, but you brought up very, reasonable concerns about him as a player.
Yeah. I guess another guy that we can talk about now, fan favorite player in the NBA is Ben Simmons. It's been announced that he's shut down for the year. So, with this being said, the Nets not in a very great direction at this point. We don't really know what their future looks like. They're going to be a playoff team this year, mostly just because of how well the season started when they had KD and Kyrie. But now I don't expect them to win a playoff series, maybe even win a playoff game at the best. So with him being out, I guess this just puts out officially that the Sixers won the trade. I mean, I've said this the whole time, but Ben Simmons isn't even going to be on the team. So I just want to hear, what do you think is next for a guy like Ben Simmons?
Yeah, and I mean, I love to be optimistic, and overall, I like Ben Simmons as a player, but I mean, this is about as bad as it gets, right? You can't really blame coaching or team fit anymore because he's failed to succeed with different coaches and different team fits and different teams, different locations, all of that. Like once again, I like him as a player. I think he does have some talent, but I don't know what team wants him at this point. He's kind of fallen into that Russell Westbrook category, except worse, because Russell Westbrook has proven that he's still a good player. He just has his moments where he's lackluster. Ben Simmons is almost always lackluster and sometimes shines that flash we saw in 2019 2018 time era. So it's really concerning for me. I don't know, like pretend you could get him on a minimum contract. Do you want, I mean, I know you don't, you're a Sixers fan, but just to anybody watching, answer honestly, do you want Ben Simmons on your team? What does he provide for you that someone else doesn't already? So I mean, I'm just gonna, in the nicest way possible, say this is very bad for Ben Simmons' future.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the upside to him, obviously still a very good defensive player and still a young player too. But like you said, I mean, offensively, he's kind of in a spot where he's not going to get better. I'm sure he's going to get it signed because this offseason he's going to make a mixtape where he shoots half court shots and then everyone's going to say that he's back. Even as a Sixers fan, obviously a little bit of bad blood between him and Joel Embiid, but he was still one of my favorite players when he was on the team. The first NBA jersey that I got. So I still, obviously, I don't see him coming back to the Sixers, but I think being in a spot where I don't think necessarily he's a bench piece. I still think he could be an offensive starter. I don't think he's terrible, but I think he just needs to be put in the right scenario too. Even if an interesting spot for him to go, if you're the Spurs and you end up with that 2 pick and you take a guard, he could potentially go in there and learn from a guy like Pop because I'm sure he could probably put him in a good position too.
Yeah, I mean, that would be interesting. I also think like, I mean, either way, I like San Antonio a lot. I hadn't really considered that because if you give him Victor too, you let Ben Simmons run the four, and that's an
No,
interest.
we've seen Ben Simmons with other tall players on the court. He has to be the tallest player on the court. It doesn't work.
Yeah, but with that being said, are you letting your team run him at the center? Like, this is my problem with Ben Simmons, right? Like, we can't even agree on what position he should play. And that's not in a fun positionless basketball way. That's in a concerning where the hell do you put him way. So
Yeah,
that's
I think eventually, his role, I see him a lot like kind of a glorified PJ Tucker, where you run small ball and he's the center,
yeah,
which that doesn't work out for most teams. But I think the best case scenario is you put him on the Celtics with Al Horford again, just because we know they have so much chemistry together, and obviously they have great floor spacing.
Ben Simmons is Al Horford can shoot a little too. Let's relax. Ben Simmons is PJ Tucker with an identity crisis. He is PJ Tucker if he looked in the mirror and thought he was Carmelo Anthony. That is who Ben Simmons is. And we see Carmelo Anthony, who is Carmelo Anthony, can't even be a key piece on a team anymore. And obviously, Ben Simmons, if I'm not making a straight up comparison, Ben Simmons has much better defense than Melo ever did. But with that being said, you can't have a guy. PJ Tucker exists because he knows he's not that good. Ben Simmons will die on the hill of still thinking he's that good. So it's not like he's going to be playing in China like all the Instagram comments will tell you. But I mean, I don't know
I
what
would see
team
more
wants
like
him.
Taiwan.
Yeah, Guangdong Tigers could use him, but in all seriousness, like he'll be in the NBA, but I don't know where, why, or how you play him, depending on what team he's on.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting because you don't want to give up on a guy that's still that young and still potentially has not obviously as high of a ceiling that he used to, but could still be a decent player in the NBA.
Yeah, I'm rooting for him. I still think he like with all that aside, when you watch him play, you can still see that he is a good player. It's just a lack of confidence mixed with some poor situations has really put him in a hole right now.
Yeah. So next up, we'll bounce over towards the NBA awards. We won't talk as much about the MVP this time just because we've talked about it so much in the last episodes. I want to talk a little bit more about the other awards too. So I guess we'll just start with that and then we can end with the MVP and talk about that as much as we want. So just to start off, the sixth man of the year right now, the favorite is Russell Westbrook, but since we've seen kind of a different a difference in like play style from him now, especially on the Clippers too. When he was on the Lakers, I think he definitely had that locked up. Other guys that are kind of in that conversation are guys like Tyrese Maxey, who now is back into the starting role. So I just want to ask you, who do you think would be your sixth man of the year?
Yeah, and I like with Westbrook and Maxey, I think those are two guys that would be deserving, but now they're both starting. So that's the interesting part with of the year award. You have to move people around. I see a lot of hype about Malcolm Brogdon. I see some Norman Powell hype even, and there's another guy that's not coming to mind that's really high up there.
Emmanuel quickly.
Thank you. Yeah,
He's
Emmanuel
the current
quickly.
he's the current favorite right now after
Yeah,
Westbrook and Maxey both got bumped off the list.
yeah, and quickly would be a really good option. So maybe this, I want to shed light on someone who I think is much deserving of it, whether he wins it or not, and that would be Bobby Portis. I really like Bobby Portis for this award. He's scoring an efficient double double on the bench while the Bucks have moved up to the first in the East. He does come off the bench for Giannis in most lineups, considering Brook Lopez as well. So I would assume he's eligible. I can't see why he wouldn't be.
Yeah, he
But
is. Bobby
yeah, yeah.
Portis is third right now.
Yeah. So I think he deserves the hype. He's playing like a six man of the year candidate. I think there's a little bit of bias towards guards who score more in the six man of the year, race. And that's kind of something we always see. That's why guys like Jamal Crawford and Manu Ginobili were locks for this every year. I think it's time that we show credit for a guy that can get you 10 points, 10 rebounds, anywhere in that range every single night on what's probably the best team in the league right now. So he would be my pick personally.
So right now, odds wise, it looks like Quickly and Brogdon are kind of the two top guys. Portis is up there, but he is the third best odds at plus 4,600. So kind of out of that race. But I think between these two guys, Emmanuel Quickly has been playing really well. But because he's ended up starting in a good amount of Knicks games towards the end of the game, getting starter minutes just because RJ Barrett either drops 20 or 5 points. There's no in between with a guy like him. And I would lean towards Emmanuel Quickly right now just because he's been having a great year and the Knicks are performing really well right now. Malcolm Brogdon, though, obviously having a good year too, but I would personally right now give it to Quickly.
Yeah, I think I would not be surprised if it's only between Brogdon and Quickly once the award show comes around. But if Bobby Portis can wrap up the season doing what he's been doing, I'm gonna be vouching for him.
So next up is the most improved player of the year right now. And right now we have Lauri Markkanen, who's the favorite, and then we have Shea right behind him. Lauri Markkanen is minus 360 right now, and Shea's at plus 300, but these have changed a lot. So I still think it's pretty close, even though the odds don't really say that much. I think people are more favoriting Lauri Markkanen. I know it was kind of close for a while, and I remember I think we talked about this a month ago, and I had Lauri as my favorites, and I think I'm going to stay with that at this point.
Yeah, and if you guys know me as a fan, I'm a huge fan of Shea. I think he's one of the best guards in the league, and I've been vouching for him. With that being said, this year it's got to be Lauri. I mean, Shea, and I've mentioned this the last time we talked about this, showed flashes of being this top tier guard last year. and there was a case for him last year to be the most improved player. But if we're talking this year, Lauri Markkanen was a guy that was getting made fun of on social media, basically booted out of Chicago, and joked about just playing on the useless Jazz and being inefficient or whatever. But he's genuinely been one of the better players in the league. He went from a guy that people forgot was even still playing to an all-star starter. So, with that in mind, if we're talking the most improved, I think he just is the most improved player. I think Shea has also improved a lot and is a better player, but he is not the most improved player to me.
Yeah, I think the NBA is in a spot where last year they gave it to Ja, and people were upset about that because Ja was already good before, but then
Yeah.
he moved into an MVP level. And we see the same thing this year. We all knew Shea was good, but now he's moved into that MVP level candidate, which is obviously a huge jump to make just because there's so many good players, but there's so few MVP, like 30 point a night players in the NBA at this point, especially at the guard position too. Um, and I think the NBA kind of wants to go back to that model since I know a lot of people were mad that a guy that was already good who got a little better in last year and Ja got it. So I think they're going to go back with Lauri and kind of go back to that most improved where a guy wasn't that great before, like you mentioned, and then took a big leap this year. And I think Lauri definitely took a huge leap.
Yeah.
And then next we have the Rookie of the Year odds, and this one is still Paolo is still minus 7,000. But I wanted to bring this up just because there's been some people saying that Jalen Williams should be in the conversation, and I want to ask you how you feel about this.
Yeah, and I think just to get it out the way, Paolo is my rookie of the year, but he gets much more touches. He is the best player on his team. His team is a lot worse. So there's something to be said for that. And I'm glad you mentioned that. Jalen Williams has impressed me. If we're talking the most impressive rookies, he's had a great jump post All-Star break. What I will say though is if I had to pin down my most impressive rookie, I'd say Walker Kessler from the Jazz. And I think that partially is me admitting I guess my flaws as a sports critiquer. Last year, I saw Walker Kessler as a guy that was a borderline first round talent, and I was making fun of the Timberwolves when they took him so high. But he gets traded to Utah in the offseason, and he's been exceptional all year. I mean, once again, Paulo has to be my guy. But I look at guys like J Dub, and I look at guys like Walker Kessler, and I'm like, hey, in a lot of other years, these are rookie of the year caliber players. So I'm impressed with a lot of those guys that went farther down the board. How do you feel about this situation?
I think Paolo is still obviously my number one guy. He's been putting up numbers that we really haven't seen from a rookie since LeBron. And like you said, it's because he gets the ball so much. He's that number one option on that team, just like LeBron was with the Cavs. But I mean, you can't get mad at a guy that is already pretty much the best player on his team and getting all the touches at that young of an age. And I know people are upset that he gets that many touches compared to a guy like Jalen Williams. You're saying, oh, well, if he got that many touches, well, he doesn't though. Like Jalen Williams, if Jalen Williams was the best player on the Thunder, they would have 15 wins right now. Like
Yeah.
that's just how it is.
Well, also like it's a play style thing too. Like if you give Jalen Williams those touches, he will be inefficient and the team would suck. Paulo, for a rookie, his efficiency numbers aren't that bad. And while Orlando sucks, he is clearly worthy of the touches. You can't, a guy is not better necessarily because he's doing more with less. Sometimes that's the case, but you can't just assign people per 36 numbers and act like that's end all be all. It's not how basketball's played.
Yeah. And Jalen Williams is in this spot because he's been playing his role so well. I think
Exactly.
that's what, and I mean, I think you said as a rookie, his efficiency isn't great. 42% from the field is still good, but he is shooting 28% from three. So
Yeah. I
just
think
not a
that's
great
pretty.
not a great 3-point shooter in Halo, but I think he'll end up figuring it out. I mean, he
Yeah.
shouldn't, especially the older that he gets too. I think that the Magic will start building more around him and kind of give them that LeBron aspect of putting shooters around him.
Yeah. And one thing I just want to say real quick. I mean, Paulo is one of the, still one of the best players I've ever been fortunate enough to see play live. And even from, basically miles away in the Syracuse Carrier Dome. You could just feel the confidence. Like when he was at Duke, you saw the confidence he played with. He knew he was the best player on the court, and you still see that same play style in the NBA. The fact that it's transitioned over, although he has pretty borderline rookie efficiency numbers, I think he's just going to continue to shine. So you're not going to hear any Paulo disrespect from me. I think he's a great player.
And then finally, before we get into the MVP, the Coach of the Year odds, Mike Brown still the favorite right now, but two other guys that are pretty close, Joe Mazzulla and Michael Malone. I think right now, I'm still sticking with Mike Brown. I know we talked about this a few weeks ago. The stuff that he's been able to do this year with a team that was not expected to be this good, and being able to kind of develop all those players, especially with Sabonis. He's been developing really well this year too. And De'Aaron Fox, who we all knew was a good player, but he hasn't really had that ability to shine. And now the Kings obviously are playing really well.
Yeah, I'm not even going to really get too into this. Mike Brown 100% deserves it. He went from a coach that was pretty horrible, honestly, as we mentioned earlier, in the LeBron era, to being one of the headlining best coaches in the league right now. The Kings are super impressive. I think he's a huge part of that. Build a good culture over there. So he's easily the guy.
Yeah, I think a guy, obviously, that I mentioned in second is Joe Mazzulla. He was up there competing at the beginning of the year, but I would say because of how good that team is and him kind of being at the expectations that the team should have been, even like you could argue maybe even being a little lower than they would have expected just because of that recent skid. But you can't really give a Coach of the Year award to a team. That was my argument too with every year that the Warriors were good. You can't give Steve Kerr the Coach of the Year when they win 55 or 60 games. That's how good they were supposed to be. When they win 72 games, 73 games, actually, that's a lot different. But I mean, we saw him get replaced for that 10, 15 game stretch one year, and then they won pretty much every single game.
Replaced by Mike Brown once again. So, yeah, I totally agree with you there.
And I think it's just good to see a guy like Mike Brown, too, who we were talking about earlier, that wasn't great with the Cavs, and then almost 20 years later, getting another chance and developing into this great player, great coach who can develop these great players.
I mean, that's one of my favorite things about professional sports. I mean, if you can stick around the game, you're going to get another chance. And Mike Brown proved that when Steve Kerr had personal issues and he stepped up in that stretch with the Warriors, and he's really proving it now. So once again, I 100% agree.
And when he wins Coach of the Year this year, then that'll give all the Jordan fans more debate saying, oh, well, LeBron had a Coach of the Year before.
Oh, of course.
If this was a year ago, you wouldn't have reacted like that too.
Oh, shut up. I mean, that's crazy. That, you can call me a Jordan fan or like whatever, but even I was never that crazy about it. I'll stand my ground on that. It's not like I'm a Bulls fan. Like I got the D Rose jersey in the back, but do not like the Bulls.
So finally, we'll get into the MVP debate. The first thing I want to bring up is what Kendrick Perkins said the other day. He said after Joel Embiid ended up sitting out the Nuggets game, he said that he was ducking the smoke and you can't sit out this game. When it comes down to these matchups, I have a vote and I'm going to remember this a moment. And my biggest issue with this quote is that Kendrick Perkins has a vote for MVP. I didn't really care what he says at all until that happened. I take everything that he says with a grain of salt. I don't think that he's a good reporter at all. And for him to have a vote in MVP is just absolutely insane to me. The reason that he's even on any of these shows is that he was in the NBA and he ended up being like the local guy, and he still kind of is that role for the Celtics. He's on their NBC streams, whatever, after the game and stuff. And he says, oh yeah, Jason Tatum played well tonight when he dropped 40 points. Like, yeah, I know, I watched the game. He doesn't have anything unique to say. And I think him having a vote is absolutely insane. And I'll give some credit. Recently, we've seen Kenny Beecham. I know we're both big fans of him. He was on Stephen A. Smith's show, and I don't know if he was on First Take, but he's going to be And when the playoffs come around, he's going to be more in that role of being on TV more. And I think it's good to see finally we're getting people who aren't in the NBA getting jobs, like people that actually watch the NBA. Kendrick Perkins doesn't watch basketball. He's pretty much, it's like when they put Jason Witten in the booth and he was just completely terrible. Like him and another guy too, Jalen Rose. At least Jalen Rose has something good to say once in a while. Kendrick Perkins has never said anything that is even remotely good, and he changes his opinion every single week. I mean, a month ago he almost got fired because he was saying that people were racist for not voting for Embiid, and now Embiid sits out a game and he's saying that he's not going to vote for him for MVP.
Yeah, I mean, these people get paid a lot of money to say things that maybe they don't believe. And I want to, this isn't going to get us, no one's going to be offering us money for the company after this, but big companies such as ESPN pay their dudes a lot of money to look like idiots on TV. And Kendrick Perkins signed a really big check to be one of those idiots on TV. As to why his
I think he
opinion
would still be
changes so
doing
much.
this even if he didn't get paid.
No, and one thing I want to throw out there is ESPN did not pay him a lot of money to make those idiotic racist remarks. Kendrick Perkins, I will go out here and say is pretty friggin' stupid anyways. But when it comes to the changing opinions, I mean, that's just mainstream media. And that's why, as you mentioned, seeing, a guy like Kenny come onto this stage, it's so refreshing. And this is why they're so well liked, I think. I think people like Kenny because he's not influenced by the money. You get him on the show and he's going to be speaking his mind. And I think that's some of the stuff that people like about Stephen A. Smith. I know he has his moments. He's not perfect, but for the most part, no matter if you like what he's saying or not, he's telling his truth. So, I mean, with that being said, I think I don't even really know how to say this, but Kendrick Perkins' opinion on the MVP race doesn't matter. And the fact that he has a vote, as you mentioned, when we acknowledge his opinion doesn't matter, I guess clearly it does because he gets to decide at the end of the day and we don't. So,
Yeah. And I guess what I'll bounce that into, I know it's been heavily debated last night. A lot of people were saying that with the Embiid sitting out, as we're recording this, this was last night,
yeah.
Embiid sitting out. I guess the narrative around it was that he sat out so he wouldn't harm himself in the MVP race. But the way that I look at this is by him sitting out, he got way more flack than he would have if he played. I think the worst case scenario, if he plays, is like the only way that he would have ruined his MVP case for which is why people are saying he sat out is if he dropped 5 points and if they lost by 50. Even if they lose this game and he performs well, they're knotted in the series. Like people just completely forgot that they played earlier this year. I know that it's coming down to the wire now, but you can't just forget that they played earlier in the year and Embiid dropped 47 and 18 on them.
Yeah, and me personally, I would have liked to see Embiid play this game, but I don't think this was him dodging anything. If you ask me honestly, I'm going to take it at face value. He wasn't healthy enough to play the game. Now, I honestly think that's all it is because if you build these other narratives around it, then Embiid definitely would have had to play if he cared about the narrative, as you mentioned. So, I mean, I'm not going to get angry or start yelling. Last episode, I came on here and I said Jokic was my guy until Embiid, shows me something. I'm willing to change my opinion. It was unfortunate that last night would have been a really good opportunity for that, but Embiid didn't play. And just to credit Jokic again, the Nuggets won the game and he put up an impressive triple double. Like that's what we've been seeing all year from Jokic. And I would have loved to see Embiid go out and drop 50 on him and get a win. It would have hurt my case, but it would have proven something to me. That might have been a moment where I could switch my mind. So I think if we're talking MVP race, it doesn't have to be this huge conversation like it has been in weeks past. But for me, Jokic ties the head-to-head series. Unfortunately, Embiid didn't get to play, but Jokic just keeps playing like this over and over again. So, my feelings are pretty similar to last week at this point.
Yeah. Well, being a biased Sixers fan, I have to throw this out a little bit. Watching the game, they were up by 20, and Jokic did come sub back in, and then they almost blew the game. A lot of people are upset with the call late in the game. However you feel about it, I don't know if you watched the game or not, but
Yeah, no, and I admit I didn't watch the full game, but I did watch around that time of the game at least.
Yeah.
So
So I just had to throw that out. Whether that I don't think that has any weight or not, I really don't care about that point. But I mean, I think it is even better too. Obviously, I wanted to see Embiid play that game, but I love to see that his report. I forget who he got interviewed by, but coming out with all these quotes before the game, and obviously that reporter put all the quotes out before the game. Um, and Embiid not playing. I just think that's funny because the reporter obviously trying to build everything up before this was billed as, I guess, the biggest game of the year just for the MVP race. If Embiid was fifth in the MVP race, no one would have cared that if he didn't play this game. And
yeah,
he said he doesn't care about the narrative. And he brought up that Bulls game that happened, I think a week ish ago now, where he only had 16 points, but he only played one half because he
yeah,
just didn't need to play the rest of the game. And I mean, he even said that he doesn't really care about the narrative. And he showed that last night. Um, I mean, I guess I'll bring up a quote that he said, like, I'm not a two-time MVP. Have never been first team all pro. What do I have to lose?
yeah. No, and once again, I'll get on here and I'll yell about how I think Jokic is better, but I respect Embiid a ton as a player. It shouldn't, and I think he's proving a bigger point. It shouldn't take a narrative to decide your MVP. And we both say this all the time. It should be, you know, it should be different than that, I guess is what I'm saying. So if Jokic, and I respect this opinion, if you think Jokic has been the best player this year, all the stats you mentioned of him being one of the best scorers ever this year, him being efficient, the Sixers being great. I think those are the points that you need to prove an MVP. And Jokic and Embiid both saying that they don't care about the narrative, I think is respectable on both accounts.
Yeah. And Embiid still has I mean, there's 7 games left in the season as we record this. They're playing against the Bucks, Celtics, Nets, Heat, Mavs, Raptors, and Hawks. And
Yeah,
a lot of those games, obviously, against the Bucks and the Celtics, he's going to have more primetime games for the rest of the year.
yeah,
And the odds are, I guess, depending on where you look, some books have them tied. And as of right now, Jokic is the favorite. But when we come back in a week, I'm sure it's going to be different. And the odds swung a lot just because Embiid didn't play. He was minus 250, minus 300 in some places last week when we came on. And now it's pretty much tied where Jokic is the favorite. And I
yeah,
guess, I mean, as a Sixers fan, overall, I want Embiid to be healthy, especially for the playoffs. So I'm not too mad about it. But as a guy who, I guess, in the end, I guess defending him for MVP, there's going to be a lot of people obviously saying that he was ducking the game, but still for me, I mean, he's still my MVP. He's proven to be one of the best players in the league for me. He's a top 5 two-way player. He's putting up a historic offensive season. He's putting up a historic clutch time defensive season. So that's really it for me. I haven't changed my opinion at this point.
yeah. And I mentioned earlier, I haven't either. For all the same, you have all the same reasonings about Embiid. I have the same reasonings about Jokic being, in my opinion, the best rebounder and passer in the NBA in general, but specifically this year. And, him being the centerpiece of a Nuggets team that I'll say again is still my finals favorite. You know, there's a lot that goes into it, but at the end of the day, I think the bigger point that we bring is that this one game shouldn't be your catalyst to shit on Embiid, really.
Yeah. And I don't think we can't just forget about the first game that they played. And I think
No,
a lot of
yeah.
people have been forgetting about that too.
Yeah, Embiid has outplayed Jokic this year. And by default, Jokic just outplayed Embiid because Embiid didn't play. So worst comes to worst, it's even right now.
Yeah. So I think that kind of wraps everything up.
Do you want to have any college basketball talk before? I don't know if we're gonna see.
Yeah, we can go over the Final Four real quick if you want to start. I didn't watch any of the Sweet 16 or Elite 8 games, so I don't really have much stake in this anymore.
Yeah, no, and I'm just gonna go quick. I just want to throw this out there because we're probably not gonna see you guys until the season's over at this point, right? With our schedule.
I
So
think so, yeah.
yeah, so I just want to throw this out there with the Final Four, and I'm gonna go quick. San Diego State, FAU. FAU they beat my Tennessee Volunteers squad which made me pretty sad. But they're a team that relies really heavy on deep 3-point shooting. San Diego State, I think, guards that really well, so I would take them. And then UConn, Miami. Miami's been my sleeper team all year. We talked about it even before the tournament started. With that being said, UConn has been beating really good teams by 30 in March Madness. I think they would beat Miami. And then just to keep it really quick, that would put UConn versus SDSU in mind. Once again, I would take UConn just for the simple reason that I don't know who's stopping them. And their defense is great, but their offense is better. They've just beat up on teams that I thought were untouchable all year. So, I guess to simply put an umbrella term on my feelings, I think UConn is going to win it all.
Yeah. And I know, I think this year, especially with all the upsets, it's interesting to look at because there's 2 points that you can make. One of them, obviously, there's all these teams in the end, and that means that there's going to be a champion who a lot of us didn't expect, and there's going to be a low seed champion, which is always interesting to see. But I guess on the other side of the coin too, without any like big name teams, I think that kind of loses the interest of the casual fan too, just because you're watching this game and you're watching a team like a game like FAU and SDSU. You're not going to get like compare this to last year. I think the amount of people that watch that Duke UNC game compared to this one is going to be like a big difference. And I guess it just depends on which side you are.
Yeah, I mean, to give credit to your point, if there's an SDSU versus FAU game on in December, you're not watching it. Just
Yeah.
honestly, no one really is. So I agree with that. Another thing I want to point out that I find very interesting, and this might be one of my last college basketball points, a number that's been floating in my head a lot is 12. That's the combined number of the seeds of the Final Four teams on average since like 1970 something. Well, right now we're at 23. So say what you will about this March Madness. I understand why people would lose interest, but it's historic. There's upsets every year. If you're not super into March Madness and this is your first time really caring, I hope you understand. You might not see it like this for a long time. So at the end of the day, at least it's interesting to me. I still find it very fun.
Yeah. And obviously we get to see a lot of players and teams be on a stage that we wouldn't normally see.
Yeah, that's the best part.
So I guess with that, it kind of ends everything. Next week, we will probably have another mock draft kind of starting April as we lead into the NFL draft season. And by next week, we'll probably have more of a set understanding of the playoffs. And depending on what happens, maybe we'll have a little bit more of a set MVP. At this point, I don't think that'll happen just because I think it's going to end up going until the last second of the last game, just because how close it's been. But I think by next week too, we might have a college basketball champion. I'm not sure exactly when that will fit into the schedule, but we had our predictions and we'll probably post about it on the Instagram, just talking about that, whoever wins. So I guess that's really it for this week, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.